Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live conversation, Caravans, an Expression of Poverty, Climate Crisis, and Corruption. My name is Nancy Trevino. I am with Presenter.org, and we are happy to be co-hosting an event with our partners, Alianza Americas. Throughout the conversation today, we'll be featuring a set of panelists that my colleague, Helena, Olea will be introducing, and the themes that we're going to be touching upon are the migrant caravans, dispelling misinformation, and how you can take action to support our partners in Central America. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll pass this along to Helena.
Hello, welcome everyone. Alianza Americas and Presente.org decided to convene this conversation shared live on Facebook to discuss the mass exodus from Central America to the United States. These collective mobilizations are usually named caravans. Alianza Americas uses the term caravans under quotes because we want to underscore that this is not a happy journey. This is not an adventure, but it is the difficult decision to travel collectively seeking safety. We should be referring to these mixed flows of migrants and persons seeking international protection as a mass exodus. This is not, again, an adventure or an expedition, but rather this is a strategy seeking safety in numbers. By traveling in this way, they are hoping to avoid many of the threats of the perilous journey north by traveling together. And they also understand that efforts to detain or contain them by local authorities diminish when groups are large and well organized. We also believe that we need to hear and understand from people and organizations working in Central America, who are those persons who are traveling in large groups. What motivates their decision to leave? And also, and very importantly, what is necessary to create the conditions under which they are able to live in safety and with dignity in their home countries? We believe that this is a very important and necessary conversation, and we think that it's crucial that we hear from organizations and individuals working in Central America. Their voices are very much needed in this table. And we are very happy to convene today for this conversation, three persons that have a lot to contribute to this discussion. We welcome Yolanda González Cerdeira, who works in the research and human rights area of Equipo de Reflexión, Investigación y Comunicación, Radio Progreso in Honduras. For those who do not know it by name in Spanish, I'm going to translate it. ERIC is the Reflection, Research and Communications team. It's a Jesuit program. We also have with us Natalia Ortiz Barrientos, who works at the Instituto Centroamericano de Estudios Sociales y Desarrollo, known by its acronym Incedes, which stands in English as the Central American Institute of Social Studies and Development in Guatemala. And our third guest is Oscar Chacón, the Executive Director of Alianza Americas. Let me start by thanking the three of you for joining us today for this conversation. And let's get on to it. I want to invite the audience, if you have any questions, please, or comments, please share them on the chat box. We will have an initial 2 rounds of questions, and we're really looking forward to listening and responding to your questions and comments. So let's begin, and let me start with you, Yolanda. Most groups convene and begin their trip north from San Pedro Sula in Honduras, very close to El Progreso, Honduras, where the ERIC is. So can you please describe to us who are the people leaving the country? Why are they leaving the country? And what are the factors that determine their decision to leave? And also, what drives them to join a caravan? Welcome, Yolanda. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Helena. It's always a pleasure to be with you and to share with Alianza Americans and the audience some thoughts. I think the caravans show us the faces and the voices of the forced migration from Honduras. We only need to read the newspapers to look at the pictures, and what do we see? We see mostly young people, we see mostly women with children and families, many of them, well, with with babies, with a lot of babies. And in that sense, I would point out that firstly, the caravans bring to light a reality that has been going on for years. In ERIC, we talk about a cycle of forced migration that has been accentuated since the coup d'etat in 2009. From then to now, Hondurans have suffered different types of crises: social crisis, education, health, environmental crisis, years of drought in the south of the country, increasingly strong natural phenomena, 2 hurricanes last year, political crisis, not only a coup d'etat, but an electoral fraud in 2017, economic crisis, and all of this is a response to a model of insecurity and violence, a system that excludes and despoils, an authoritarian and militarized political system. I mean, for the last caravan had around 7,000 people, no? The one in 2029. But normally, except for this year, for last year, for obvious reasons, 9,000 people flee Honduras every month. I would like to share three points that I think explain better what I want to say. The first one is the testimony of a young man when a colleague of mine asked him, "Why are you leaving the country?" And he answered, "Because in my neighborhood, I have a better chance of getting shot than getting a job." The second is a verse of a poem by a woman from Kenya, and the poem is called Home. And the verse, I think, is really for Honduras as well. It says, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." And the third thing I would like to share is the data of this shark. In 2019, Honduras was the 4th country in the world with the most asylum seekers. Of course, these causes become stronger last year with COVID as United States and every places, but as well with 2 hurricanes that landed in a country with a corrupt government who took advantages of these tragedies for its economical and political interests. Last November, 4 million people were affected by these 2 hurricanes, Eta and Iota. Almost 100,000 people were sheltered, and 1 million people have to be evacuated. Losses of up to 40% of the GDP are estimated. 2 months later, now, there are still people on the street because they lost everything without any count of public support of response, only threats that they will have to vacate the street. Many of the people, many of the young people, of the families, of the women with children in this caravan came from the neighborhoods and cities most affected by these hurricanes. And why in the caravans? I think, Helena, you talked something about this. We have to understand that the people who go in the caravans are the most vulnerable, the poorest, those who cannot afford a coyote, and they face one of the most dangerous roads, the route to the United States. According to reports from shelters in Mexico, almost 70% of people report having been assaulted in this road. And we are not talking about, but it's much, much more dangerous for women. So the caravan reduces the danger they go through on their own, especially for women and for families. That's the main and most important reason that a person joined a caravan.
Thank you, Yolanda. Very, very powerful words to begin this discussion. Now, I would like to ask Natalia to join the discussion. Natalia, you're based in Guatemala. For those of you who are not very familiar with the geography, the journey starts in San Pedro Sula, which is the coast on the Atlantic, on the Caribbean, and then they move to northern Guatemala, the shorter path in the route to the United States. So I was wondering, Natalia, what you can tell us about those Guatemalans who decide to join the caravans when they cross through the country. And I was hoping that based on what Yolanda said, you could tell us how their motives are the same or differ in the case of Guatemalans en route to the US, and why are they leaving the country? Welcome, Natalia.
Thank you, Helena. Well, I will take into account some of the points that Yolanda talked about it. And one of the reasons some Guatemalans joined the caravans while they're around the country en route to the United States, some of them joined them because, one, it's a mean to reduce the risk of being assaulted, being attacked by gang members, drug cartels during the journey, but also as a mean to reduce not to pay the coyote sometimes. And when it comes to the causes of why they migrate, the northern region of Central America shares a common history, common factors of expulsion, but with different points, main points. In the case of Guatemala, some of the indicators of poverty, malnutrition, school dropout shows the increase in the inequalities gap. And in contrast, we are seeing a state that does not create social public policies to attend the needs of the most vulnerable population groups in the country. And on top of that, we see a systematic regression and cooptation of the state that reduces the citizens' trust in its institutions. For example, we see the Corruption Perceptions Index that was published today showed us that Guatemala is on the 149 rank of more than 170 countries. So systematically also, the society has been perceiving that the country is promoting more actions towards corruption and the perpetration of impunity. And additionally, we see on the economic indicators and factors related to why Guatemalans migrate. In 2020, the remittances accounted for 14% of the GDP of the country. So we see a strong dependence of remittances. It was around $11,340 million that in the concept of remittances. And this money that is sent by millions of Guatemalan migrants is directed specifically for consumption of goods in households, access to education and health services, rights that should be guaranteed by the state. So, and also we see the indicators of violence and insecurity that also, and the impact of natural disasters such as Hurricane Eta and Iota in the past months, that creates a specific circumstances that when we see we don't have we can, if we can trust our institutions to have access to health, education, or relief programs in such a complex context such as this pandemic, migrate to the United States for some families is the only strategy to continue surviving, to seek better conditions for themselves and for their families. So I would say to end my participation with this question is that as long as these structural conditions in Guatemala and the northern region of Central America do not change, migration would continue to be the only survival strategy for many families, many young people, many that are fleeing poverty, violence, the need to seek better conditions to live.
Thank you, Natalia. I think it's important and very useful to listen to the situation in both countries to establish the parallels and the differences, and that's why we invited Oscar to this conversation, because we would very much ask you, Oscar, to help us kind of systematize the factors presented by Yolanda and by Natalia. How can we explain these massive flows from Central America to the U.S.?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in the company of Yolanda, Natalia, in this conversation. Let me begin by saying that perhaps play a bit of devil's advocate. We indeed have called what's been happening over several years now massive exodus. But in reality, they're not that massive. I mean, it is an exodus, true, but it is not that massive when you take into account the size of the populations that we are talking about. Honduras is roughly at 10 million people nowadays. Guatemala is roughly at 17 million people nowadays. El Salvador is about 6.5 million people nowadays. And when you look at the people who have actually come to the point of desperation that pushed them to join caravans, collective ways of migrating, knowing that they don't have permission, to do that. I think it's basically telling us something that I often explain in a massive loss of hope. People have deeply lost the sense of hope for a better tomorrow in their own countries. And to me, this loss of hope can basically be summarized in three areas. On one hand, let's not forget that these are countries that before 2020 were regarded as among the poorest nations in the Western Hemisphere. And what I mean by that is the most impoverished populations, because nobody's born poor per se. We are impoverished because of the set of economic, social policies that are in place. And in this respect, these are countries that are shining examples of economic inequality. And that was true before 2020. It only got a lot worse over the past year because of the fight against COVID, the global pandemic, the very many weather events, ending with ETA and IOTA, because they were not the only one. There were other weather events also that impacted these very countries over 2020. The second thing that is really coming to our face right now is something that many experts have been telling us for the past 10, 15 years. That is that these very nations are among the most vulnerable places in this hemisphere from a climate change perspective. And clearly, it is not just that there were weather events, storms, hurricanes, and whatnot in Central America, but the fact that they are happening in countries that never really care about building shared well-being, collective well-being for most of their citizens. And so that's the number 2 factor that I want to also highlight. And the third factor is that there has been over many years now an increasing deterioration in the condition of governance, in the condition of life. People may call it a deterioration in democracy, but frankly, for many, many citizens in Central America, be that in Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador, the fact that you are much more likely to be shot than to get a job tells you everything, about how much democracy has been constantly deteriorating. And so the fact that we have this latest caravan, frankly, shouldn't surprise anybody. I mean, it is actually the natural result of conditions that the economic elites, that the political elites, and that the US government has actually allowed to come into place. And so the odds, in face that we are now, namely the idea that we can somehow contain this and avoid from it happening, it's almost like an impossible dream, simply because the conditions are such that people are so incredibly desperate that they are indeed seeking these particular collective ways of trying to migrate, perhaps in an illusory idea that they will be safe. We saw what happened at the Guatemalan-Honduras border. Most Americans did not see it because CNN wasn't there reporting, but people were severely beat. Women, children, young people, elderly. The army and the police were in full force, complying with what? With what the US has asked them to do, which is to contain irregular flows. And so clearly we need to do better. We need to respect the right of people to leave their countries, to seek humanitarian protection. And I think that that is the essence of the challenge that the countries in the region, but also the US and Mexico, will have to face in a different way if we are to call it humane in any way.
Thank you, Oscar. In many ways, I feel that you're kind of inviting us to ask ourselves whether the flows should not be larger, considering the very bleak picture that all of you have painted. And so I want to ask Yolanda to help us think or consider what needs to be done in Honduras so that the situation changes. What could happen so that Hondurans find opportunities, find the jobs that you just mentioned at the beginning from those 3 factors? That the country is not a shark, but rather welcomes them and allows them to live with dignity, to thrive in their country. What is necessary in Honduras, Yolanda?
Well, I like this question because it allows me to start talking about the so-called American dream when we talk of migration. Eric and Radio Progreso, we did a survey on what the Honduran population dreams about. And the United States doesn't appear in the dreams of Honduras people. The family dreams are in this order: to have a decent job, to have a house, for everyone to be able to study, to walk freely in the streets, to have food. And when asked how they dream of their country for the next 10 years, they dream of a country without violence, with all the people working, without corruption and impunity, with education and health for all. These are Honduras' dreams. So what do we need to fulfill our dreams? And I think, or I wish I had the clue, I don't have, but at least I can point out some things. Firstly, well, we have to be aware that right now we are facing a deep and humanitarian crisis in Honduras, probably in Central America. But as we say in Eric and Radio Progreso, this humanitarian crisis brings together 3 types of crises that must be faced. Firstly, an inequality and exclusion. 5 people in Honduras concentrates the equivalent to the annual minimum wage of 2 million Hondurans. We can give more examples later, the situation of education, health, etc. We face an environmental and ecological deterioration. Oscar gave some examples. And of course, we face an institutional crisis. I mean, the rule of law is not here anymore. But well, I think we cannot be so pessimistic if we see the landscape we have in front of us, because probably right now we could be in a moment of opportunity in Honduras. After the hurricanes that affected the most productive area of the country, where Eric and Radio Progreso is placed as well, the Valle de Sula. Here, it's the 60% of the country's wealth is concentrated where the hurricanes affected. So in these situations, we find many and different actors in society that see the need to think about reconstruction, but beyond that, they think and they see the need of the transformation. And I think we have to take profit of this opportunity, you know, they take this moment. And in Eric, we propose what we call the shared basic agreements. What is this? I mean, actors from different sectors of society, grassroots organizations, businessmen, trade unions, peasants, intellectuals, international organizations, let's agree on minimum consensus to start rebuilding democracy, society, and the models. Agreement on what? We think on these big areas. Firstly, a socioeconomic and environmental agreements, land, property, agrarian policies, health, education. Secondly, socio-political agreements, human rights, the freedom of expression, the situation of indigenous people. And third, institutional and political agreement. What is the rule of law, the role of the armed force, the justice system, etc. But for this, to get this, well, in Spanish is ABC, the basic agreements. For our point of view, the first step we need to do is to work for stronger community organizations, for stronger human rights organizations, grassroots organizations, to work to strengthen the dialogue between social movements, so that the social movement can build its own agenda and that can discuss it with the other sectors, equal footing with them, and not, usually these discussions, they are always very disequal, you know? And I would say last but not least, at this moment, it's also important to look to the north, and we have to say that I mean, the thing that the Trump is not anymore in power is clearly an opportunity. At least that thing is clearly an opportunity for Honduran people and for Honduran organizations, and well, and for this basic common agreement.
Thank you, Yolanda. We have the responsibility to seize on that opportunity, and we really hope that we see a change in policy that ultimately impacts on Hondurans. That's really what we need, and that's why we are convening this conversation, because we think that these are the necessary discussions that we need to have with actors in Central America. We need to listen and understand what's going on, and policy cannot simply be dictated unilaterally from the United States. That's what we're trying to bring to the table. Natalia, I want to ask you, because you are in Guatemala, if you can please, develop further a point that Oscar made that I think it's very important, and it's the repression to the caravan by these armed forces in Guatemala. We saw some images, but what Oscar's saying was very true. This was really lost by mass media, particularly in the United States. There were a number, of videos made by journalists and advocates that were part of the caravan. But if you can help us understand better what happened in Guatemala, what was the result? How many people were detained, were deported? Oscar mentioned the violence, so it would be important whether you have any information in terms of people who were injured as a result of that action. And also, we believe that a lot of those Hondurans were left kind of stranded in Guatemala. So what information can you share with us about that?
Thank you, Helena. As Oscar said, this was a very serious situation in which the police and armed forces that were displayed in different points of the route of the caravan. There was a main situation in which there was the use of force against the migrants in the caravan. Many people were injured, and more than 3,000 migrants, most of them Hondurans, were detained and deported to Honduras, according to the migration authority. This is a very serious situation because the immigration legislation in Guatemala establishes that the Ministry of Interior can coordinate actions with different other governmental institutions to guarantee the safety of migrants, not use to force against them. So these actions, not only these actions, but also the statement of the executive branch, especially the Foreign Affairs Minister, establishes that in the discourse a zero tolerance position to irregular flows in the country. So these actions are responding more to a security and containment strategy rather than to a perspective of protecting human rights of people who are in a vulnerable situation. With many of them probably would need immediate need of care and protection. We're talking about people who are probably seeking asylum or other protection mechanisms that are available in the country and under international human rights law. But right now, the people who were injured were attended by civil society organizations, as well as the US agencies, such as the UN Refugee Agency, UNICEF, and IOM, and as well as other organizations around the route. And as you said, many people around the world learned about what happened in Guatemala in that day. Just many journalists, national and international journalists, travel all around to Badohondo, one of the places when this altercation happened, and were able to make more visible what happened. Currently, authorities are enforcing immigration controls on the border, not only in the border between Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, but also the northern border between Guatemala and Mexico. And many from these 3,000 persons who were detained and deported, the authorities are searching through the different cities and communities around the route where the caravan was dispersed, are looking for more migrants who are in the country, who are staying in the country despite what happened. But there are different normative process that allows them to stay in the country. So one of them is what we know in Central America as CA4, CA4, which it establishes that Central America persons from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua can remain in one of these countries for 90 days, as long as they enter the country with a passport, with their passport of a document. And also the immigration law establishes that if a person who is not Guatemalan requires assistance and protection independently of their migration status, can go to the migration authorities to access to these protection measures. But right after, even many days after what happened, we haven't seen a response for the state with that perspective. It has been more of a containment of the use of force, of even if we can say the abuse they committed against this vulnerable group has received a lot of many expressions of contempt against what the state should have, what the state of Guatemala have been doing. And as Oscar and you also said, also as a measure to respond to what zero tolerance position that has been established in the United States for the past 4 years.
Thank you, Natalia. And I think that that's precisely part of the challenge that we have. We need to understand there is a part of the legacy of the Trump administration that is outside of the United States and that cannot be erased through an executive order. There are other elements that need to be put in place. And so that's why it's important that we understand what happened in Guatemala. The condemnations have been important, and we should seek accountability, even though it may be an uphill, almost an impossible battle. That's part of the cries that we need to do and to denounce what happened. Oscar, I want to go back to Yolanda's answer to talking about seizing the opportunity. The Biden administration, we know, included in the bill that will be submitted by Congress on this new immigration bill. The proposal includes $4 billion in aid to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. If approved, how should those resources be spent based on the conversation that we have had here? And also, I want to ask you, we talk a lot about economic aid and the power, the transformation power that it has. But I want to ask you whether there are other things that a new US administration could put in place that definitely would have an impact on those 3 countries. And I want to add a final piece to this challenging question. We have a question on the chat box, which is also asking us for the role of regional organizations. Who else can come to the table and contribute? So with all of that, the floor is yours.
You want me to do all that in 2 minutes? Got it.
I'll give you 5.
Let me begin by emphasizing the if approved that you mentioned, because that's a big if. Let's remember that the electoral result of last year, it was good in the sense that it allowed us to get rid of Donald Trump. I don't think that there would be many people that follows Alianza Americas or Presented.org or any of the organizations represented here, that is not relief, that we don't have to deal with Donald Trump anymore. But let's face it, the electoral results last year were also not the best in as far as truly advancing in an expedited manner changes in the law that need to occur. The US Senate is still divided 50-50. That means that a lot of initiatives, including the immigration reform plan that Biden has floated and that has been transmitted to members of Congress, it's very unlikely that we are going to see that specific initiative come to fruition anytime soon, simply because of the arithmetic in the Congress. The Senate and the House are in no position to guarantee that will actually be passed anytime soon. So I want to emphasize that because the road ahead likely will be one where we will need to push small pieces of legislative changes that are more likely to actually find its way to the finish line instead of this large, very ambitious idea of a single piece of legislation that changes not everything, but a lot of the things that are broken without immigration policy. But with that said, I do find extremely positive that the Biden administration is acknowledging that for as long as we do not address the factors that trigger migration from within each of the countries, we are not going to be able to find a viable solution. And that is a principle that Alianza Americas has pioneered over many years, in the US debate about immigration policy. Nobody will give us credit, but I can take credit because I know I've been there for the last 30 years, insisting that that is a much more rational way of understanding what needs to happen to bring a healthy humanitarian equilibrium in the way migration flows are taking place in this region. So I believe that what the US can do, and they don't have to wait, for this particular immigration bill to pass, they can begin to reorient immediately any new foreign aid appropriation for Central America, for each of the countries. And the foreign aid appropriation must break with the past. Because in the past, what they've done is simply put more money into a system that they know it is broken. It's like putting money in a rat hole. Namely, it goes nowhere, except increasing the fortunes of corrupt politicians, corrupt business leaders in our countries like Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And so part of what needs to change is to really shift the notion of who should be the recipients of US support. I think Yolanda is shining an example, this coalition that is putting together this basic common agreement is one good example of a partner that the US government should elevate as an important partner because it combines members of the private sector that finally are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel and realizing that unless we build better countries, we will forever be doomed, in as far as having any possibility of truly ending with nations where fewer and fewer people want to live. I think that that's a goal that we all share. I love to see, people staying in their countries because they are happy in their countries. But for that to take place, we absolutely need to do things differently. So in this respect, I also believe that the US government can also help with something that we often take for granted, don't even give it the due credit it deserves. And Natalia mentioned a little bit of it. Last year alone, these three countries received $23 billion in remittances. Biden is talking about 4 billion over however number of years. That's like peanuts. It's nothing compared to the monies that are sent by hardworking Central Americans to their loved ones in these countries. I believe that's something the US government can do, and this actually President Biden can do tomorrow if he wants, is to grant temporary protected status to all Guatemalan, Nicaraguan, Honduran, and Salvadorian nationals that are residing in the US that do not have documentation right now. And by doing so, he would be enabling these people to have better jobs, to have better incomes, and therefore perhaps getting them to send more money to their relatives. But let's be real, no matter how much money is sent on a yearly basis in remittances, it will go nowhere unless we have better plans in each of the countries to really come out of the structural conditions of oppression that we have all described already and that continue to push people out. So unless that changes, and I believe we can change it, I'm faithful that we can change it because I do see more open-minded in this new administration, but we are not yet where we need to be.
Thank you, Oscar. We have a question from Luis Felipe Rojas, from a journalist from Voz de America. And I want to go back to that final part of the question where I asked you about the cooperation of regional organizations in this regard. How can they also be a part of the change that we need in Central America?
Well, I mean, I am hopeful, and I'm sure that Yolanda and Natalia can also contribute to this, but I am hopeful that institutions that are in place, I'm talking about particularly the SICA, just to mention one example, the System of Integration of Central America, the Central American Development Bank could also be useful vehicles to understand that it is not good enough to go back to where we were back at the end of 2019. That if we really want to take advantage of the crisis that we have endured, especially over the past year, not only the pandemic, but also the weather events that I mentioned, it is imperative that we open up ourselves to new paradigms, to new arrangements, to think about development, to think about well-being, to think about security, to think about democracy. All those elements are elements that regional institutions, including even hemispheric-wide institutions, like the Inter-American Development Bank, and why not even the World Bank, can actually do a different read of the events and come up with solutions that are unlike what they have suggested before. And in this respect, I also believe that the US government can do a lot more. The US can do more to really set these countries in a direction that will really create opportunity, and as a result, create fewer people wanting to live using unauthorized mechanisms. But also the US can lead the world in bringing them to understand that this is a moment where we can actually launch something no small than the Marshall Plan after Second World War in Europe, to really look deeply and seriously about the many factors that keep making these countries places where more and more people want to live.
Thank you, Oscar. You reminded me of the Economic Commission of Latin America's plan that was developed at the beginning of López Obrador administration, again, as another regional strategy that was not funded and that is somewhere out there shelved. So one wonders whether there's a possibility there.
Yeah. But if I may say something, and help me please, Yolanda and Natalia, I fully agree that we need a brand new, ambitious international initiative to help Central American countries, but let's not fool ourselves. It's not going to be paid for entirely from foreign sources. If we are not able to tax, the people that are reaping billions of dollars in profits in Honduras, as poor as it is, billions of dollars are generated in profit in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, that are not paying their fair share in taxes. We must understand that we also need to address very difficult issues like tax policy, and budget priorities. Because if we don't address those issues from within, no matter how much money is brought from outside, it will not be good enough, and it will not last for as long as rebuilding these countries to become better places will take.
Thank you. Yolanda, if you want to add something, this would be the moment. And I was thinking of that figure you specifically gave in terms of the income of how many people compare, to show disparity in incomes. And I think it's a good photograph of the inequality challenge and the opportunity that a tax policy could bring about. There's also a question from Francisco Lopez on Facebook that I want to share with you, which I think is a very common, curiosity of many. How are the caravans organized? Are there leaders behind it? Is it a social media post? Is it word of mouth, WhatsApp? What results in thousands of people convening one day in the bus terminal and deciding to leave? What's the process behind this?
Well, I think it's a question lots of people have. I don't think, in our experience, we cannot say there is always the same way to organize a caravan. From 2008 to 9, perhaps 1, 2, 3, I can take like 5 or 6 caravans, and each of them were different. I mean, it's difficult to understand for a person in the United States, perhaps, but that people agree spontaneously to leave the same day their home. But if we take into account what I said before, 9,000 people leave Honduras monthly. I mean, it's not so difficult that if you are leaving in January, it's just, okay, I can leave the 15th of January and I go with others. So I understand it's difficult, to perhaps with, for other countries, but it's not so difficult to meet in the same day, since a lot of people is leaving every day. It's true that some caravans, they just got spontaneously organized, but they were more organized. For example, regarding the towns or the neighborhoods, or I give you a concrete example of these caravans. There were some groups of young people that they met in the shelters during the disaster. They met there in El Progreso. They realized they were young, unemployed. They were renting a house. The house was completely damaged. And they decide, talking among themselves, live together. And this is where they organized. Well, they just came together and decided to go together and protect themselves together. Another caravan, I remember when the first one, they were walking and they slept in one city in Honduras, and 2 or 3 people decide and said, okay, let's organize ourselves so that the family with children can go more protected than others. But I think it's an example as well that there is not 4 big heads thinking and conspiring. These caravans. I think we can say it for sure, because the proof is most of the caravans have surprised everybody, not only governments, but also a humanitarian organization, human rights organization, migrants organization.
Thank you, Yolanda. I think it's important. It's a myth that needs to be dispelled, about this conspiracy behind the caravans.
If I may, Helena, this is similar to people who ask in the US, how is it possible that so many millions of people came out and protested in support of Black Lives Matters? Who organized it? Who's behind it? There is this thirst, this hunger to try to find the one individual or the one group that is behind all of it. This is exactly what we are facing, with the caravans in Central America. Imagine lots of dry wood. a lot of people can come and put a little bit of a fire and you'll have a big fire going. So it's more a situation of people finding themselves so desperate and somebody coming with the idea that we'll do this and it happens. So that really hasn't, I mean, I've seen so many stories in Facebook, you know, blaming many, many different contradictory sources as the forces behind the caravans. Let's not fool ourselves. I mean, with everything that has been in place for so long, what's surprising, as you said, Helena, is that it is not more people packing their bags and going.
Yes, thank you. We have a last question, and I think it's an important issue that has been addressed by all, but I want to ask it specifically to Natalia. Pamela Yates is asking us, I guess, with some level of surprise, 11 billion in remittances to Guatemala. So I wanted to ask you, Natalia, whether you can describe a little bit more the amount of remittances and give us more information in that regard.
Sure. Before that, I just wanted to add about what Oscar said about regional structures that could be an actor to seize these opportunities. I would mention also the Regional Conference of Migration and the Regional Network of Civil Society Organizations on Migration that we, in Spanish, we most of the time call them CRM and ROCOM, but these regional spaces have a very significant impact in dialogue process that could help the region to, in this new context, to promote structural changes to the northern region. And well, answering to your question, yes, in 2020, last year, the country received $11 billion in remittances. What is very interesting about this the statistics of 2020 is that between July and September of 2020, the central bank in Guatemala reported that between these 3 months, the country received historically $1 billion each month. And this data has increased has reached out the GDP in accordance when we visualize the GDP and the amount of remittances that came into the country, we see that 14%, these $11 billion represented 14% of the GDP of the country. Even exceeds the percentage of the about how much the country exports to the world. So as I said before, the remittances continue to reflect how many families, that take the decision to migrate to the United States or to other countries are playing an active role in the family economies more than the state itself. And these funds are used for these families to buy food, to have access to education, so that members of the families can continue studying, even go to college, to invest in health services that sometimes the national or the public health system cannot provide. But also in some small investments like properties, small businesses, and also to promote to savings in different through different sources, some of them through banks, and different studies especially promoted by the Inter-American Dialogue, shows us that in many in many small cities in Guatemala, with when we cross data like number of people who are deported, people who have been who migrate, and the volume of remittances through the financial system, we can pinpoint out some of the some of the cities when the influx of remittances have impact in the communities. And we not also see it through this factor that I said before, but also in how the communities change, not all in infrastructure, in cultural and economical activities. And so this is the case of Guatemala. When we see the contrast in with the GDP, we see that countries like Guatemala, like Honduras and El Salvador, also have a strong dependency of the remittances income in relation to the GDP. Most of in the case of these two countries, it's over the 20% of the GDP.
Thank you, Natalia. Unfortunately, the hour has passed. We had so many questions that we were not able to discuss today. And I think that this is a reminder that this is a good format. We believe that it's important to have these conversations in English because, as we pointed out, there is a void of information that we want to fill out. And we think that the voices from Central America need to be heard and need to be considered in policy responses in the United States. And that's what we are trying to do today. Yolanda, Natalia, and Oscar, thank you very much for your time today, for your generosity with your knowledge and the information that you brought here to the table. I think that this is also an important and first conversation on the desperation that leaves people to leave their countries, impoverishment, corruption, but also the climate crisis, which is another element that is contributing to the economic crisis and the inability to find jobs in the countries. And I also want to highlight from another part of the discussion what remittances represent, because we see the number and we say, oh, the number is huge, but we should take a few things into account. Many of those individuals who are sending remittances do not have a regular immigration status in the United States. They are undocumented and they are definitely struggling. And in spite of that situation, when they migrate, they are not only seeking a better life for themselves, but also for their families. And that's why they are sending remittances, because they are supporting their family members back home. And I think that that's also an important element in the discussion. And that to pull out Central America from where it is, it has to be an international effort, but also the countries themselves need to help themselves with, as Oscar was pointing out, for instance, a tax reform. That's also an urgent matter that needs to be addressed among the long list of other matters like addressing corruption, strengthening the rule of law in these countries. Thank you for the conversation today. I think we're left with many questions and we hope to host future conversations like this one today. Thank you for everyone who tuned in at the time of the conversation and to the many others that would listen to it later. Thank you and goodbye.